and I'm sure many of you have actually read it, because I can see from the commentary on Amazon.com that it has been extremely widely read, one of the bestsellers.
And my Gujarati edition just came out.
Gujarati edition just came
so
out.
bear that in mind.
Okay, so we should have editions in the remaining 20 languages of India as well. They will be coming.
By the way, the Tamil edition, Hindi edition had already come out. So
okay, all right. Yeah. So, all right. So in the book, I want to start with something very interesting you say in the preface, and this is the date of publication is 2020. So I take it by the time the book came out, you were already the External Affairs Minister.
Yes.
So this is writing as the External Affairs Minister. The minister says, "It was unsettling to discover, after 4 decades as a professional diplomat, where many of the assumptions on which we had operated were now being called into question." And later on, of course, in the book, you talk about the dogmas of Delhi and so forth and all. In what way the assumptions were coming into question? What were the Delhi dogmas that perhaps were probably the subject of this questioning?
Well, if you look, we are now marking 75 years of our independence. Okay. So what we call Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav. And 75 years, I mean, any kind of round number or a 25, 50, 75, these are good occasions actually to reflect. Okay. Now, writing a book is also a good occasion to reflect, because it's like a self-audit. And the reason why I wrote that was because foreign policy and diplomacy is a certain, there are a certain set of people over a period of time who determine and decide what is right, what is wrong, what is smart, what is not, and they have a view of the world, okay, on which, and that's the assumptions that they make. Now, the reason I wrote that, which is questioning the assumptions, was that the world has changed so much, and the opportunities for India and the challenges for India have correspondingly been impacted. That the assumptions we would have had 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago are today challenging. And if the book was written really as an exercise in provocation, which is read the book and argue with me. And I actually, what I did was each chapter of the book in some forum, I took that chapter, it could be a university, it could be a business forum, it could be a closed group. So I did some variant of that book and then sat and, argued with people and then, kind of put those points into it as well. So it was very kind of dialectical as an exercise. I give you a very simple example. Take our attitude towards the United States. If you look at the attitude towards the United States between late 40s and I would say 2000, I take that as a year, the year Clinton came to India. For almost 50 years, due to various reasons, I'm not saying we were at fault or the US were at fault, the fact was we regarded the US with suspicion, with a lot of wariness. There was a very substantive relationship. But the overall, the foreign policy assessment of the US was of deep caution, if not of deep suspicion. Now the fact is, when the world began to change, the tenability of that view, I think, came into question. Now, we struggled. I mean, even the nuclear deal in 2005, 2008 was a struggle, because on the one hand, the US was offering some very clear advantages. What held us back was an innate, historical, deeply rooted, possibly validated suspicion of the United States. So we kind of said, well, there's a gift horse, maybe we really need to look it in the mouth. So it has taken us actually a lot of effort to overcome the earlier assumptions in order to forge a different relationship with the United States. And one of the big differences which really Prime Minister Modi has made is because on this relationship he has not carried ideological baggage. He is not a person, who's rooted in a certain worldview which makes you fundamentally distant from the US. He's been very practical and outcome oriented and done a cost benefit analysis and found various convergences with the US. So you've seen actually remarkable progress in the last 8 years. But you would not have had that if you're not prepared to challenge the assumptions which held us back earlier.
So, to what degree do you think India's economic failures, especially during the first 4 decades, limit our ability to assume a more significant role internationally? And here I want to draw a little bit of comparison with China. Now, China was also during these decades kind of as much of failure as India was economically. Yet it seems that somehow China was able to pull its weight a little more than we were able to.
That's an understatement, but yes. No, seriously, I mean, they are today 5 times your economy.
Yes.
So I think it's
Not
more
today
than a little more.
But even if we look back, pre-2000, let's say, or pre-1995, at least one gets the sense that the Chinese were able to pull their weight in those decades a bit more than we were able to. Why was there this difference, even though we were a democracy and the Chinese were obviously an authoritarian regime?
Well, I've sort of addressed that in the book. I've attributed, again, this is a retrospective look free of judgment. It's an analysis rather than a blame game. I think there were 3 big things which went wrong for us. One was, of course, at the start, the partition. The second was the delay in exercising the nuclear option. And the third was the delay in the economic reforms. So China not only did not get partitioned, actually China grew in this period territorially. China exercised its nuclear option early, 1964. We did a half-hearted move in 74. We did it, but we didn't do it. So we had to do it all over again in 98. And that's, 74 was tough enough, but by the time you stretched it to 98, you actually created a big burden on yourself and also allowed Pakistan to catch up in that period. And of course, for me, the most serious was really the economic reform, because if you look, China, you can say, embarked on its economic reform pretty much after Mao died. So by 1980, 79, China was very clearly set on a course of economic reform. It took us another decade plus. But there's a very big difference also. Here's the paradox. Precisely because China, in a sense, was during the Cultural Revolution period, the Great Leap Forward Cultural Revolution period, China pretty much it did itself so much economic damage during that period that there were no vested interests left by the time the late 70s came who bitterly opposed those reforms. So in a sense, once the Chinese leadership said we are going down this path, because they were in a worse situation than they were, it was easier for them and more decisive for them to go down that path. In our case, we delayed it by a decade plus. Then there were interests which kind of continued that debate and slowed down that reform. So we never had that sort of clean slate ability to progress with China. So it's not just China had a head start of a decade. China also had a pathway which was much more obstacle-free than it was for us. And then I would argue, in many ways, China had a better strategy. Because to me, it's not just that we did 1991, 92 and said, okay, now great, we are launched. I do believe, and I think you and I don't entirely agree on this aspect of it, that our model of globalized, of embracing the world was deeply flawed. We did not build our domestic supply chains, we did not support our small and medium industries. We thought the world economy would be fair to us, and therefore the more we exposed ourselves to the global economy, the more we would progress, we would become competitive. I think the reality was that the world economy was full of players who were not market economies, who gamed the world trading rules, who actually, in a sense, used their practices to fundamentally disadvantage our businesses. So we are one of the few economies where our own companies do not get a level playing field. So late start, no clean pathway, a lot of domestic lack of support, not the right vision. I think these were all factors. And I think today, correcting that, I mean, to me, the Atmanirbhar Bharat is not a slogan. It is actually a corrective of a flawed model of globalization that we pursued for more than 2 decades, and I think which has not served our country well.
I think you're right. We will disagree on the second part of it. But let me emphasize on the first part. I think that I completely agree that very spot on. That the way I put it to my students in the classroom is that, socialism and democracy interacted very differently than socialism and authoritarianism did in China. In India, because of democracy, it was much harder to change, and the opposite kind of forces really came through.
I'm not being a contrarian, but I might even challenge that. I mean, not historically. I don't believe being a democracy is an obstacle. I don't believe it's a disadvantage. I mean, look, I'm just giving you the last 3 years, okay? 3 years which I have seen as a politician and a minister, and I look at what has happened in India in the middle of COVID. And when I see the pace of change in India, the fact that we have been able to create a social safety net, that the Indian system today can day after day look after 800 million people, 2.5 times the population of this country in terms of their food requirements, that we can put bank money into the accounts of 400 million people. The fact that today we can actually create a health system which people felt is something which a low-income economy cannot do. The fact that we built 25 million houses, and if you take average size of 4.8 as a family size in India, that means you really given houses, home ownership to 100 million people. And all of this is done in a democracy. So I think sometimes, democracy has been used as a cop-out for bad governance.
Yeah, I don't think, I disagree on that side, that part. I think in the fact of this that, somehow coalition politics is in the way and so forth, I think was used. That part I'll agree with you. But nevertheless, the pace of change in India has been clearly much slower in terms of policy. Democracy per se is not in the way, but you do need a leader at the top.
Sure.
Who is willing to really take the risk.
Yeah. And I think democracy can deliver such a leader, and is delivering such a leader.
Yes, it can, but more often than not, whereas in the Chinese authoritarian system, once Deng Xiaoping took the view that, look, the old way is out, new ways coming through, I think he could really bring about the change in a much more forceful way. And certainly you'll agree that in democracy you've got to build up some consensus, and particularly if the leaders at the top are not fully driven to the change will be slower. I think that certainly that has been our experience. That I'll mention, for example, just one example. Take the labor law reforms. It has been recognized for 30 years, and it took Prime Minister Modi to finally get them passed through the Parliament. Even on farm laws, in the end, it was a very courageous move on the part of the central government, but in the end, politics led us to withdraw those. Whereas I think in an authoritarian system, those sorts of things carry through.
No, look, I'd put it this way. I think at the end of the day, it should not be authoritarian systems deliver and democracies don't. Yeah. Because I can turn to another neighbor who's been largely authoritarian for the same period, the one on the west. If you'd like the one on the east, you can take that as well. And I would argue that their authoritarian regimes have actually completely screwed up their economy. So you cannot make a correlationship between progress and authoritarianism. It's a kind of determinism, and which is not your intention, I know.
No,
but I would enter that caveat, saying at the end of the day, you need a leadership, you need a vision, you need the ability to implement, and maybe democracy makes it harder. I think it makes it more sustainable. Perhaps a more diverse society needs a democracy. It is harder to do through a more authoritarian way. So I just feel at times the direction of the argument leads us to beat up on democracy more than democracy deserves. And I think somebody needs to defend democracy.
Absolutely. No, there's no issue with that. I completely agree and we are, in fact, one of the examples in the 17 years from 2003 to 2019-20, India has grown 7.5%. I think this is a very little kind of advertised and very little known fact. But for a 17-year period, the growth rate has been 7.5%. And that probably is the fastest so far for a democracy. So we have actually ourselves done that. So with that, I think, what has happened now in the last 15 years or so. So 2007, I checked, we were 12th largest economy globally. And we have now become the 5th largest. Big difference. I think, perhaps setting aside China, that is the steepest climb that any economy has had in terms of the global rankings and all. How much you think that has been helpful in bringing India? I mean, I sort of think back, 2008, I wrote a book, India, the Emerging Giant, the title.
I remember that.
And Steve Cohen, who was he's no more of a political scientist at Brookings Institution, he would say that, well, it looks like India is always emerging but never arriving. But I now feel that actually if I had to write a similar book, the title would have to be very different. It is a country that now very much on the global scene. How much do you think it is the economy, and how much it is a bit of rebranding also of India internationally by Prime Minister Modi?
No, I don't think it's rebranding. I mean, rebranding would not be sustainable if the reality did not support it. At the end of the day, any product is as good. The reputation of a product is as good as a product. I mean, you can add a delta factor, but it can't be dramatically different. I do think, and I can make comparisons over multiple decades. I mean, today, the fact that we are the 5th largest economy, how we have come through COVID, how we are today dealing with the headwinds of the Ukraine conflict, how we have actually transitioned into the digital era. I think these are all how in fact our diaspora and their successes have changed the perception of India in the world. I think it's a accumulation of multiple factors, but at the end of the day, you should give the world this credit. The world's a very hard-headed place. Nobody kind of buys sort of a spiel. I mean, people test you out through policies and practices and your decisions. And when people today do see, in a difficult situation, India responds. We have today, certainly in our part of the world, developed that image of a first responder. Nepal earthquake happens, Yemen civil war happens. I've seen during Ukraine. I mean, a whole lot of my fellow foreign ministers actually have told me that they were following who could evacuate out of Ukraine. Now, the fact that we did 20,000 was for them staggering number. There were people who were struggling to do 200. So there is a performance evaluation. I think the world's a very competitive place, and within this, roughly 200 countries of the world, they do track each other. They do exchange views. They do judge you by, your crisis response, your non-crisis response. They do judge you by your ability to take stands. So if you're part of a grouping, it's a kind of run-of-the-mill, okay, you are one more of a herd, versus your ability to stand your ground or to say, well, I think this is what should be or should not be. I think all those things matter. And definitely, I would say, compared to where we were earlier, as a foreign minister, it is a huge advantage for me to represent a country which is in a much stronger position than it has ever been. On the other hand, as I had the occasion to tell someone during my book release, a Gujarati book release, I said, look, I would envy the person. They asked me what would be the world in 2047. So I said, I have no idea, but I envy the person who would have my job in 2047. So because, I can see the trajectory, and the world respects that. So at the end of the day, it's a mix, but finally the economics is key. I mean, if you ask me in all of this, nuclear matters enormously, but if you tell me, okay, out of all the variables, pick one. If you had a chance to, saying one domain you really want to put everything into, no question, I would put it into the economics.
So the way the economic situation looks to me, the person in 2047 may not have to envy you too much, because a lot of this will happen in the next 6 or 7 years. And let me just give you the background of why I said this. I think, well, today we are already fifth largest. A lot of restructuring has happened in the last 2 or 3 years in the economy. The way it looks, I mean, that's an area I sort of know and understand well. And the way it looks to me is that the kind of restructuring that had happened during the last few years of Prime Minister Vajpayee, with a massive kind of macroeconomic reforms, the recapitalization of the banks, and and that led to this massive investment cycle, which really carried the economy ultimately to about 8% plus growth for several years. I think something very similar to me, we'll see how it unfolds, and I may prove wrong, but something very similar is underway currently. First, the restructuring has happened. You begin to see the signs now, the kind of recovery that we have seen in this last quarter, for which the data came. The economy jumped 13.5%. It comes on a low base, but still 13.5% in a quarter is quite unprecedented. Unemployment figures actually completely reinforce that. India now at last putting out the unemployment figures at fairly fast pace and in a timely fashion. So we have unemployment rate, urban unemployment rate for the quarter, same quarter, which is the second quarter of 2022. It is the lowest actually since 2017-18, when this periodic labor force survey got started. Investment rate during that quarter is about 34.5% of the GDP, quite unprecedented in the last about 15, 20 years. So all the indicators I see suggest to me that now the economy is really about to take off. My calculation is that it will take another 6, maybe 7 years for India to actually get to the third largest economy. At that point, of the 3 largest economies, 2 largest will be developing countries. 3 out of 4 largest economies will be in Asia. So it seems to me that what you're perhaps thinking, might happen in 2047 is not very far away. It is going to happen, at least economically. And that's where I want to sort of get your comments on, how you see this is going to impact, because you will still be the External Affairs Minister at the time.
Well, I don't know about that, but look, I think those are very sound points you have made. But in addition to that, I can think of the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns. So I can imagine that in the course of this decade, there will be factors, good and bad, which we have not actually calculated upon. I mean, look at the problems we are facing today. I mean, if I told you even a year ago that we would be worrying about not just the price, but actually the availability of fuel, of food, of fertilizer, nobody would have thought this. So the beauty of history is it's very hard to anticipate. So I would be optimistic, no question about it. I also feel the kind of domains which would kick in would actually help India more. I definitely see in many ways a much more intensively digital world. It is really how much of a role it has in shaping your everyday life, shaping governance. And I think many of these, India would embrace those changes much more naturally. I mean, it's that, in a sense, the least developed has the least to lose in embracing change. Mm-hmm. So we have shown in many areas we've actually been very fast embracers of change, which is very different from that initial economic period where I was comparing India and China. China embraced that change in the 1980s because it had less to lose. So I see your point. I share your optimism. I have no question by the end of the decade we would be in a very different place. But I would still say you are hitting about third gear out there. It's really when your incomes, per capita income starts to go to a much higher level. I mean, today we are still at what, $2,000. I mean, when you
2020.
Yes. When you hit
2,200.
Yeah. So when you start hitting the 10,000 plus zone, as China has done, then it's a really different ballgame.
Okay, let me just ask one more question, and then we'll open it to the audience here. So I return to your book, and this is how you describe, I think, the strategy. This is a time for us to engage America, manage China, cultivate Europe, reassure Russia, bring Japan into play, draw neighbors in, extend the neighborhood, and expand traditional constituencies of support.
That's exactly what I'm doing. That's in essence what we've been doing. Mind you, it's not been easy. I mean, managing China hasn't been easy. Reassuring Russia hasn't been easy. Getting Japan into play hasn't been easy. So, those are the natural challenges of a changing world. But I was trying for a kind of a lay reader really to sum up the multiple directions which we would have to address in different ways. So, life, diplomacy is not linear, it's not unifocal. It's also not a zero-sum game. I mean, it's sometimes people think if this relationship is moving better, that means that relationship must be worse. That need not be the case. I mean, I think a lot of that depends on our strategy and our skills. So the thrust of what I was projecting was a kind of a development along multiple axes towards multiple centers, multiple poles, multiple regions. And that requires an enormous dexterity. That it's like having multiple balls up in the air and you've got to keep it going. And, well, I'm really getting into mixed metaphors, but it's like a high trapeze act with multiple balls in the air. And, you've got to keep getting better and better at it if you really want to progress. And in an interesting way, I would suggest that this year has been a demonstration of it. That, we have had challenges in the Indo-Pacific. We've had challenges in Eurasia. We have tried to kind of effectively address both. We are today seen even more strongly than before as speaking up for the interests of the global South. But we are also seen as actually a deeply democratic power which has underlined the values, the relevance of democracy, which looks today as in the digital domain at the importance of trust and transparency. We are also seen as an additional engine of growth which is trying to make supply chains more reliable and resilient. So you have like multiple roles, multiple targets, multiple relationships, and it's like a it's like a 360 which you got to keep doing.
Perfect. Okay, so we'll open up. Just one thing before all of you raise your hands. I really want to give first chance to the Columbia students and faculty. So please, especially if you're from media, don't try to be the first. Just hold your questions. You get chances to ask these questions to the minister in many different forums. So students, all right? Okay, let's come here. Yes. There is microphone. So.
Thank you so much for your talk, Dr. Jaishankar. I wanted to ask you a question in regards to a lot of students who might, like myself, have come, for example, to the US or other countries for their education, perhaps a career that follows. So we come to a point in our lives where we've had to face this very difficult decision that sometimes we end up being citizens of the countries that we've studied and worked at. In India, currently, a dual citizenship, it does not allow that. So I know there's been some talk of changing that, but nothing substantive yet. So could you shed some light on like what is the reason that students like us have to leave our home countries like in an official way and for like leave our passport, which I personally do not want to do. I'm sure a lot of people don't. So could you tell us like if that is going to change anytime soon, or what is the thought process behind not giving dual citizenship? Thank you so much.
Shall we take two more questions?
Yes, absolutely. I can cover more.
More efficient, yeah. Yes. Yes. Vivek, there is one extra microphone we can pick up from there, and maybe somebody can help us.
मंत्री डॉक्टर जयशंकर जी नमस्ते। मेरा नाम संजीत और मैं यहाँ सिपा में मास्टर कर रहा हूँ और मैं प्रोफेसर अरविंद जी का क्लासमेट भी रहता था। और
क्वेश्चन
ठीक है। अगस्त में आपने तो एशिया सोसाइटी संस्थान के शुभारंभ के अवसर पर आपने टिप्पणी की कि अपने चीन भारत संबंध और एशिया सेंटर में जोर दिया और आपने कहा कि मैनेजमेंट ऑफ कॉन्ट्रडिक्शंस बहुत ज़रूरी है, पर आपने भी कहा कि क्वोट अच्छा है क्योंकि तो क्रॉस रीजनल कॉर्पोरेशन के लिए, लेकिन लोग मानते हैं कि क्वोट चीन के विरुद्ध करते हैं, इसलिए तो ये कॉन्ट्रडिक्ट आप कैसे संभालेंगे और क्वोट की दृष्टिकोण से भारत का नॉन अलाइंड ट्रेडिशंस हम कैसे समझें एज अ इंटरनेशनल अफेयर स्टूडेंट? धन्यवाद।
Okay, we'll take one more and then.
Should I tell people in English broadly what he said? Basically, the issue was he was referring to something I said in August about India-China relations. How will you manage the contradictions in India-China relations, and really where does non-alignment fit into it?
Okay. Good morning.
Good morning, doctor. Thank you for your words. I'm from Mexico, and I think economically speaking, our countries are very similar in some aspects. So I would like to hear your opinion on how can we improve economic growth without making inequality get bigger in our countries, which I think is a big issue. Thank you.
Okay. Let the minister answer, and then we'll
okay.
take one more round. That's all.
Sure. First, on the dual citizenship, I think in a way, governments in India have recognized the dilemma of people like you. So they have started during Prime Minister Vajpayee's time. They have tried to create a particular category which will allow you to be a citizen of another country but yet have a very privileged association with India. So, we started with two, it was a PIO, Persons of Indian Origin card, and overseas citizen of India. So we've now combined it, made it into a single program. So we have to recognize today that the world is a workplace for Indians, and it is very likely in a greater knowledge economy kind of world, more and more Indians will look for jobs abroad or look for study abroad. There are, after all, today more than 1 million Indians who study abroad. So the attempt is to find a middle ground between your predicament and our regulations. Now you'll ask me, therefore, why do you have those regulations? The reason is, if you look at the the challenges, the history of India, the partition, the complexity of what we face, for us to move into dual citizenship is not something which can be readily and easily and securely done. I think there are considerations which would urge caution as well. So it's something people have gone into very deeply. Now, having said all that, by the way, what I know of this country, you can easily work here and prosper here without changing your passport. So that's also a suggestion I would leave with you. Regarding the India-China contradiction, look, it is, for me, I look at it from a political science perspective, but also a larger historical perspective. You had, in our times, the biggest change we have seen in the world is the rise of China. No question about it. Okay. Now, what that has done so far is it has, because of the comparison, it has, in a sense, shall I say, mitigated somewhat the dramatic rise of India, which is a point which Professor Panagaria was, in a sense, also making. That if you evaluate India on its own merits, how much we have progressed, the growth rates which he was speaking about, is fantastic. But then you have China, which has risen faster, more dramatically in the same time span. The issue for us today is, how do two rising powers in absolute proximity to each other find a modus vivendi in a dynamic situation? That's a very, very complex problem. And in history, actually, there are very few analogous situations. Powers have arisen with a gap or with a space, a geographical space. It's easier to deal with that kind of situation. So I was also using the occasion to really send out a message that it's in our mutual interest that we find a way of accommodating each other, because if we do not, the whole idea that, Asia, the rise of Asia is contingent on the two biggest economies of Asia getting along with each other, or the three biggest economies of Asia getting along with each other. Now, how the, non-alignment, I would actually say, rather than necessarily use that term, I do think the world today requires independent countries, independent-minded countries who take positions. My sense is the politics of the last 6 months has shown that there is a space out there for countries, who are not part of a very polarized scenario. So I think that demand in the market, you can say, is still very, very strong. The Mexico, the question about equality, growth and inequality, it is a big issue. It is a big issue, and you have today two kinds of inequality. Obviously, inequalities within societies and inequalities between societies. And I would argue that the globalization mantras of the 1990s and the first decade of this century are today stand severely challenged. And this is not an intellectual argument. I mean, if you see the politics of the world, if you see what happened in this country in 2016, or what has happened in Europe, what happened in Brexit, I mean, all these are examples today that of a belief in societies that globalization is not working well for them. And one of the main reasons for that is a perception that globalization has been very unfair and very unequal. And if it is to be sustainable, there has to be a fairness element injected into both interstate transactions and intrastate development. And I think that's a challenge which societies like Mexico and India do face.
Okay, I think we can take only one more question. Let's take it here. Yeah, go ahead.
We can take a round. Huh? We can take a round. I got to leave.
Can we do a round? Okay.
Yeah,
so,
Minister.
Okay. So
Thank.
wait. I never called for you. Okay. Sorry, you can't do that. Yeah, just because you get the microphone doesn't. So.
It's called an early mover advantage.
Hi, sir. Thank you for taking my question. My name is Khushbu. I'm an alum from Columbia Journalism School, and currently I'm with South China Morning Post. I'm doing this correspondent. My question
Sorry. I told you not the media guys. Okay.
Back to the
we
mic.
have somebody here. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Am I loud enough?
Yes.
Yeah, Minister, thank you so much for speaking with Columbia. It's really an honor to hear you. And for my question, I'd like to say thanks to technology. We've had the chance to hear you often. And I hope one day I become half as good as Loretta you are. And
Question.
Question.
my question, Minister, over time, India has sort of growing conversation in India that we have reclaimed our true rightful place in the global order. But facts do speak otherwise. We continue to struggle at global level to get our action approvals timely and get it quickly. Our neighbors are seem to find a better trend in China thanks to their spending power. And our friendship with the US is perhaps shallow.
Question.
No.
Get to the question.
Support the defense supplies of our neighbors. Having said this, these could be recent examples. Having said this, don't you think that our foreign policy is more rhetoric than substance? Maybe we are claiming much more than we actually do, and that's something that we're hoping that you can have your comment.
Suppose I said no, would that answer your question?
It does. Okay. So let's get here. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, good. You're holding microphone. Go ahead.
So, my question to you is, what is India's strategy when it comes to trade agreements, particularly the recently concluded ones? And are geopolitical concerns taking precedence over trade interests?
Yeah. So, okay.
The young lady at the back.
Already done.
Yeah, go ahead. Peach.
Good morning, His
I'll come on this
Excellency.
side.
The last time I saw you was in the Indian Embassy in Beijing.
Question.
Question.
So there's some word going around that there will be a Chinese embassy in Chennai, which is where I'm from. So do you have any information about when it will be established?
Consulate. Okay. I can take one more.
Okay, one more. Go ahead. Yeah, there is a microphone. Get the microphone.
Sir, how long will we have to wait before India gets permanent seat at the Security Council? I know you are here to do a lot of work on the security.
I'm working on it.
Yeah.
So, okay. Look, I seriously want to answer that first question. Okay, you got the mic. Okay, this is absolutely cut off. Okay, last.
Sir, thank you so much for your talk. I'm a SEPA student. My name is Ishfaq. I'm from Pakistan. Engaging America, managing China, cultivating Europe, reassuring Russia, bringing Japan into play is what India desires. And as you said, that India has never been stronger right now. It has been in its whole history. But when we look at the domestic situation in India, where social divisions are getting intense. So do you think your domestic policy is going to affect your foreign aspirations to, project your strength?
Sure. So let me start with the first question of the gentleman there. Is it all rhetoric? I don't think objectively anybody can say that, because if you take measurable indices of whether your foreign policy is working or not, and typically what would be measurable indices? Is your foreign trade increased? In our case, because we are a developing economy, has your foreign investment grown? Are you today part of key international bodies? Does your word count in big issues like, say, climate change, terrorism, tax and black money issues? Are you part of the key international institutions? I think if you use any yardstick today, we are more present, we are more influential, we are tabling new ideas, new proposals. Our economic footprint in the world is growing. So I honestly think, even if I was my own worst critic, that I would recognize really a lot of these achievements. I don't think it is just our way of words. Maybe we are good at it, but I think there's a very solid, practical set of achievements, including, by the way, in our neighborhood. If you see today how much more our neighboring countries are linked to us. When I look far away, I was in a meeting a few months ago with a bunch of countries from the Caribbean. All of them very pointedly said, we got our first vaccines from you. Okay. So for the rest of the world, when they look at what happens when there's a crisis, who delivers, who's active, these are countries, by the way, in the Western Hemisphere. So they could have got it from someone else, but they didn't. So I think you should give foreign policy that credit, that things have changed a lot, especially in the last decade. I accept that there are challenges. There will always be challenges. As I said, India, China, how do we compete? Where do we collaborate? Where do we contest? It will be there. Nobody is going to give us a free pass. That's not the way world politics works. But I have the confidence today to compete. I know that in many areas I can do better than I was doing before. And by the way, the world knows it too.
Absolutely.
So the second issue, the trade agreements, we have done a trade agreement with Australia and UAE recently. We are in the middle, fairly advanced in negotiations with the UK. We have recommenced with the EU. We are quite hopeful out there, and there'll be a few others which will happen. Is there a geopolitical angle to it? I would say at the end of the day, trade has to be done primarily on trade merits, and that's actually what I keep saying to my trade minister. You have to tell us you've got a good deal. I would sort of not press you to compromise on the economic merits of a trade agreement. But trade agreements also have to understand the politics and the systems. And I would argue that's been one of our challenges, that if we are actually opening our economy to others who are non-market, who have support systems which advantage them hugely, who can actually wipe out sectors of your economy, who can build huge commanding market shares, then I cannot disregard the politics of it, because the fact is countries have today weaponized trade, they have weaponized finance. So I cannot say this is an economic box and that's a political box. Those boxes are today meeting in different ways. So I have to keep the politics in mind. I have to keep the nature of the economy of my partners, of my potential partners in mind as well. The issue on the, I assume you mean a consulate in Chennai. To be very honest, there was a time when we were thinking of expanding our respective consular presences, but I do not recollect a recent conversation out here. But in any case, at this point of time, very frankly, I think it's important for our relationship with China to come back to normal. So I think that's where our focus is. And the relationship, as I keep telling people, is not normal for reasons which all of you know. On the Security Council, I was serious when I said I'm working on it. It's obviously a very hard task, because at the end of the day, if you say, what is the definition of our global order? The P5, the permanent members, is a very crucial definition of what the global order is about. So it's a very fundamental, very deep sort of transformation that we are seeking. We believe the transformation is overdue, because this was the UN is a product which was devised 80 years ago. And 80 years ago, by any standards of human creativity, is a long time ago. And if you look, the number of countries, independent countries, have quadrupled in that period. And the case, there are big parts of the world which are left out. But if I were to, in a sense, go to Professor Panagaria's description of where India would be, by the within a few years, this will be the third largest economy in the world. It will be the most populous society in the world. It is a country which, to have such a country not there in the key global councils, I mean, obviously it's not good for us, but I would also urge it's not good for the global council in question. And I do believe that with each passing year, I sense in the world a greater and greater support for India to be there, because we do command today the confidence and trust of very large parts of the world. I do not want to compare it with the current P5, but I would at least say a lot of countries perhaps think that we speak for them with a high degree of empathy and accuracy. And finally, the last question, look, every country has its politics, okay? In politics, people will use arguments which they believe work for them or which will resonate. I think I do not agree with the premise of what you are saying. I look, again, as someone on the ground, I look at 3 years of what has been really a tough time for every society, of going through COVID, of trying to protect growth, foster growth, of seeing how benefits are given. And when I hear the talk of divisions in India, I can only tell you, I threw some numbers out at you, that 800 million people get food, 400 million people get money, about 100 million people have benefited from houses. You have a polity which is conducting a massive social support exercise. And to me, I do not see any discrimination in the manner in which that is done. When I see delivery on the ground, yes, there is the argumentation, and often, very bluntly put, the argumentation is of vote banks which have historically profited by tokenism and by projecting that the interests of a few are actually the interests of many. So at the end of the day, do look at what is happening in India. Voting rates are rising. At least in our country, elections are not questioned. Okay. Huh? So I want to tell you, I mean, this is a country where the polity is working, where the delivery is happening on the ground. There is an air of optimism. You have to see it. I mean, when I travel around the world, the world's been a pretty tough place these last 3 years. And a lot of people are feeling very down. That's not the mood, that's not the sentiment in India. And it's important for people to see that. So trust me, it's working well for us.
And India has arrived. All right, so, well, I was going to say that, so thanks, Dr. Jaishankar. I think it's been fantastic. Next time you come again, we'll have to have you here. There are a lot of others who wanted to be here and couldn't be, so we hope we can have you again.